I'm Kai, 34, and for 12 years I sat in a concrete cell, wrongfully convicted of a crime I didn't commit. Through every appeal, every sleepless night, every birthday that passed in silence, my family was nowhere to be found. No visits, no letters, no phone calls. They had written me off completely. But the day the judge declared me innocent and the prison gates opened, there they all were, tears in their eyes, arms wide open, acting like they'd never abandoned me at all. What they didn't know was that I'd spent those 12 years not just fighting for my freedom, but discovering truths about my family that would change everything forever. If you've ever been abandoned by those who were supposed to love you unconditionally, this story will resonate deeply. Like and subscribe for stories of resilience, truth, and the complex journey of forgiveness. The crime scene photo still haunts me, blood splattered across the white kitchen tiles. My stepfather's body crumpled near the refrigerator. I was 22 then, barely understanding how quickly life could shatter into irreparable pieces. It was a Tuesday night in March when the police knocked on my apartment door. I'd been living on my own for 2 years, working construction during the day and taking community college classes at night. The officers stood there with grim faces, asking where I'd been between 9 and 11 p.m. the previous evening. At home, studying, I told them, which was the truth. I had a midterm coming up in accounting. Anyone who can verify that? I shook my head. I lived alone, had been alone all evening with my textbooks and instant ramen. The officers exchanged glances that should have warned me, but I was too naive to understand what was coming. They arrested me right there in my doorway, handcuffs cold against my wrists. The charge, first-degree murder of my stepfather, Harold Whitman. Harold had married my mother when I was 15. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't particularly warm either. Just a man who tolerated his wife's teenage son. We'd never been close, but I certainly had no reason to kill him. The idea was absurd. What shocked me most wasn't the arrest itself, but my family's reaction when I called from jail. My mother's voice was ice cold through the phone. "I can't help you, Kai. The evidence." Her voice broke. "How could you do this to us? Evidence? What evidence?" I hadn't done anything. But as the days passed and my court-appointed lawyer laid out the prosecution's case, I began to understand how thoroughly trapped I was. My fingerprints were on the murder weapon, a GA kitchen knife from Harold's own set. Of course they were. I'd helped cook dinner there countless times over the years, but the prosecution painted it differently. They said I'd gone to the house that night, argued with Harold about money, and killed him in a rage. The timeline seemed ironclad. A neighbor claimed to have seen someone matching my description, leaving Harold's house around 10:30 p.m. My car had been spotted in the area, and most damning of all, Harold had apparently told a coworker that he and I had been having problems lately. None of it was true, but truth seemed irrelevant in the face of such organized evidence. My family's abandonment was swift and complete. My mother stopped taking my calls. My younger brother and sister acted as if I'd never existed. Even my grandmother, who'd helped raise me, turned away when I looked at her during the preliminary hearing. The message was clear. They believed I was guilty, not just legally guilty, but actually guilty. They thought I was capable of murder. The court transcript from my trial reads like a betrayal manual, each page documenting how my own family helped seal my fate. I've read it dozens of times over the years, searching for some sign that they fought for me, that they questioned the narrative being built around my guilt. I never found it. The prosecution called my mother as their star witness. I watched her walk to the stand in her best black dress, the one she wore to church on Sundays. She wouldn't look at me as she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. "Mrs. Whitman," the prosecutor began, using her married name like a weapon, "can you describe your son's relationship with your husband?" My mother's voice was steady, rehearsed. Kai had been acting strange lately. Angry. Harold mentioned that. Kai had asked him for money several times in recent months, and Harold had to refuse. This was news to me. I hadn't asked Harold for money not once. I was proud of my independence, of making my own way. But my mother continued, painting a picture of a resentful stepson who felt entitled to Harold's resources. Did Harold ever express concern about Kai's behavior? Yes. Her voice cracked slightly. He said Kai had been watching him strangely, following him around the house when he visited. Harold felt uncomfortable. I wanted to scream. Harold barely acknowledged my existence when I visited, which was rarely. But my court-appointed liar, a tired-looking man named Jeffrey Chun, who seemed perpetually overwhelmed, barely objected to any of it. My brother testified next. 20 years old and clearly uncomfortable, he nevertheless corroborated my mother's story about my supposed requests for money and odd behavior. When asked directly if he thought I was capable of violence, he paused for so long the judge prompted him to answer. I don't know, he finally whispered. Maybe. My own brother thought maybe I could commit murder. My sister, just aiding, was the prosecution's final family witness. She described a recent family dinner where I'd allegedly gotten angry at Harold for some minor comment about my college choices. According to her testimony, I'd stormed out, shouting that Harold wouldn't always be around to control everyone. I remembered that dinner. I'd left early because I had to work the next morning, and Harold had made a joke about community college being training wheels for real education. I'd smiled and said goodnight. No anger, no threats, no dramatic exit. But 3 members of my family had just testified under oath that I was volatile, money-hungry, and potentially dangerous. The jury absorbed every word, their faces growing more convinced with each testimony. My lawyer's cross-examination was pathetic. He asked softball questions that allow my family to reinforce their statements rather than challenge them. When I suggested lines of questioning that might have helped, asking about my work history, my academic performance, character witnesses who could speak to my temperament, he waved me off. We need to focus on reasonable doubt about the physical evidence, he said. Character assassination is hard to overcome. But it wasn't character assassination if your own family was doing the assassinating. It was character execution. The worst moment came during my mother's cross-examination. Jeffrey asked her almost apologetically, Mrs. Whitman, despite these concerns you described, you never felt the need to contact police about your son's behavior before the night of the murder, did you? No, she replied. I thought he just needed time to mature. I never imagined. She broke down crying, and the prosecutor objected before she could finish. But the damage was done. My mother had managed to suggest that she'd been protecting me from my own dangerous nature, right? Up until I finally crossed the line into murder. When the guilty verdict was read, I turned to look at my family in the gallery. My mother was crying, but it looked like relief. My siblings stared at their hands. Not one of them met my eyes. As the bailiff led me away in shackles, I heard my grandmother's voice rise above the courtroom murmur. At least now we can grieve Harold properly. That's when I understood. My conviction didn't just solve the state's case. It solved my family's problem. With me gone, they could mourn Harold as the victim of a troubled young man rather than face any deeper questions about what might have really happened that night. The visitor logbook from my first year in Millfield Correctional became my obsession. Every week, I'd ask the guard to let me see it, running my finger down page after page of names, searching for any family member who might have tried to see me. The pages told the story of my abandonment in stark black ink. Other inmates' names appeared regularly, but mine remained conspicuously absent. Week after week, I watched other prisoners get called for visits. Tommy, who'd been convicted of armed robbery, saw his mother every Sunday without fail. Carlos, serving time for drug distribution, had visits from his wife and 3 kids twice a month. Even Big Jim, who everyone knew was guilty of the aggravated assault that put him here, received weekly visits from his elderly father. But my line in the visitor log stayed blank. I wrote letters constantly during those first months. Long, desperate letters to my mother explaining what had really happened, or rather, what hadn't happened. I wrote to my brother about our childhood, reminding him of the countless times I'd protected him from bullies, helped him with homework, covered for him when he broke curfew. I wrote to my sister about her graduation from high school, which I'd missed because of the trial, promising her I'd make it up to her somehow when this nightmare ended. Every letter came back, marked, returned to sender, or simply disappeared into the void of the postal system. My mother had apparently instructed the entire family to cut all contact. No exceptions. The phone calls were worse than the letters. At least with letters, I could pretend they might be read before being thrown away. But phone calls meant hearing the click of disconnection. The mechanical voice telling me the number was no longer accepting calls from this facility. Or worst of all, hearing my mother's voice say, "We have nothing to discuss," before the line. When dead by month 6, I stopped trying to call home. The other inmates noticed, of course. In prison, family contact, or the lack of it, becomes part of your identity. Guys who got regular visits held a certain status, proof that someone on the outside still cared about them. Those of us without visitors formed our own informal group, though we rarely talked about why our families had written us off. First year's always the hardest. An older inmate named Frank told me during one particularly dark moment when I'd watched the visitor processing line form without me for the dozenth consecutive week. Family either sticks with you or they don't. Sounds like yours made their choice. Frank had been inside for 8 years on a manslaughter conviction. His family had stuck by him for the first 3 years, then gradually drifted away as appeals failed and the reality of his long sentence set in. But at least he'd had 3 years. I'd had 3 days. The hardest part wasn't just the loneliness. It was the doubt that began creeping in around month 9. When your own family, people who've known you your entire life, believe you're capable of murder, it makes you question everything about yourself. Late at night, lying on my narrow bunk, I'd find myself wondering if maybe I had repressed the memory somehow. Maybe I really had gone to Harold's house that night. Maybe I really had picked up that knife. The doubt was poison, eating away at my certainty about my own innocence. If my mother, who'd raised me, who'd kissed my scraped knees and helped me with homework, thought I was a killer, what did that say about who I really was? It was during one of these spirals of self-doubt that I met Raymond, an inmate who'd been wrongfully convicted of rape and served 14 years before DNA evidence freed him. He was back in the prison as a volunteer, working with guys like me, who maintained their innocence. Your family's belief doesn't determine your guilt, he told me during our first conversation. Sometimes the people closest to us are the least equipped to handle our worst moments, or in your case, what they perceive as your worst moments. That conversation planted the first seed of what would become my survival strategy. If my family wouldn't fight for my innocence, I'd have to fight for it myself. My prison library card became my lifeline, a small piece of laminated plastic that opened doors my family had slammed shut. The card itself was unremarkable, just my inmate number, photo, and the date I'd first checked out a book, but it represented the beginning of my transformation from victim to fighter. The Millfield library wasn't much to look at. A converted classroom with mismatched shelves, fluorescent lighting that flickered, and the perpetual smell of disinfectant mixed with old paper. But it was quiet, relatively safe, and filled with something I desperately needed: knowledge. I started with legal texts, devouring everything I could find about criminal procedure, evidence law, and appeals processes. My court-appointed lawyer had been useless, but maybe I could become my own advocate. The legal language was dense and confusing at first, but I had nothing but time to learn Mrs. Rodriguez, the prison librarian, became an unexpected ally. She was a small woman in her 60s who'd worked at Millfield for over 20 years, and she seemed to recognize something in me that others missed. "You're not like most of the guys who come in here asking for law books," she told me after I'd been a regular for about 3 months. "Most of them are looking for loopholes, technicalities to get out on. You're actually trying to understand the system." She was right. I wasn't looking for a trick or a shortcut. I was trying to understand how I'd ended up here and what it would take to prove my innocence. Mrs. Rodriguez began setting aside legal journals and case studies that might help, and she taught me how to request books from other prison libraries through the Intersystem Loan Program. But survival in prison required more than legal knowledge. I had to learn the unwritten rules, the hierarchies, the delicate balance of respect and distance that kept you alive. Tommy, the armed robber who got weekly visits from his mother, became an unlikely mentor in prison politics. "Keep your head down, but not too far down," he advised. "You don't want to look weak, but you don't want to look like a threat either. And whatever you do, don't let anyone know you're working on your own case. Guys don't like inmates who think they're smarter than their lawyers." I learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of prison life. I discovered which guards were approachable and which ones looked for excuses to write disciplinary reports. I figured out which areas of the prison to avoid during certain times of day, which inmates to nod to in acknowledgement, and which ones to pretend not to see. Most importantly, I learned to manage my anger, the rage at my family's betrayal, at the system that had failed me, at the liar who barely fought for me. All of that fury had to be contained and channeled productively. I started working out religiously, using the physical exhaustion to quiet the mental anguish. Physical fitness became another form of survival. Prison is a place where weakness invites predation, and at 22, I was young enough to be seen as easy prey. I spent hours in the weight room, building muscle and confidence in equal measure. The other inmates began to see me differently, not as the confused kid who'd arrived a year earlier, but as someone who belonged, someone who could handle himself. By the end of my second year, I'd established my routine: mornings in the library researching case law, afternoons in the weight room or the yard, evenings writing in the journal I'd started keeping. I was no longer the broken young man who'd arrived, expecting his family to fight for him. I was becoming someone who would fight for himself. The doubt that had plagued my first year began to recede, replaced by a growing certainty that I'd been set up. The evidence against me had been too neat, too convenient. Someone had wanted me, convicted, and my family's cooperation had made it possible. I just had to figure out who and why. The bundle of unsent letters I kept in my cell grew thicker each year, held together with a rubber band that stretched to accommodate my persistent hope. These letters represented every milestone, every holiday, every moment when I thought maybe this time someone would respond. I wrote to my mother on her birthday every year, describing how I was doing, sharing small victories like finishing a college course through the prison education program or helping another inmate learn to read. I wrote about how much I missed her meatloaf, the way she used to hum while cooking, the bedtime stories she'd told me as a child. I never mentioned the trial, never expressed anger about her testimony. I just tried to remind her of who I'd been before everything went wrong. Those letters never got sent. After the third year, I realized they were too desperate, too pleading. My mother had made her choice that my brother's graduation from college happened during my 5th year inside. I wrote him a long letter congratulating him on his engineering degree, remembering how I'd helped him with math homework when he was struggling in high school. I told him I was proud of him, that I knew he'd build great things, that I hoped to see some of his work someday when I got out. That letter joined the bundle. When my sister got married in year 7, I wrote her the longest letter of all. I described the dress I imagined she wore, how beautiful she must have looked walking down the aisle, how happy I was that she'd found someone who loved her. I wrote about teaching her to ride a bike when she was 6, about the fort we built in our backyard, about how I'd always tried to protect her from everything scary in the world. I wrote that I was sorry I couldn't be there to walk her down the aisle since our father had died when she was so young, but that I hoped Harold had done that honor justice. I told her I understood why she couldn't invite me, why having a convicted murderer for a brother might complicate her perfect day. I never sent that one either. The hardest letter to write was to my grandmother when she died in year 9. Other inmates had told me about it. News travels fast in small communities, and several guys were from my hometown. I wrote about how grateful I was for the summers I'd spent at her house, for the way she taught me to make her famous apple pie, for the countless nights she'd let me stay up past my bedtime to watch old movies with her. I wrote that I was sorry I couldn't be at her funeral, sorry that the last time she'd seen me was in that courtroom when I was sentenced. I told her I hoped she knew somehow that I hadn't done what they said I did. I hoped she remembered the grandson who'd helped her tend her garden, not the convicted killer the newspapers had described. Writing to the dead felt different than writing to the living. There was less hope involved, but also less pain. Grandma couldn't reject my letter because she couldn't read it. Watching other inmates receive mail became a form of torture I couldn't avoid. Mail call happened every day at 2 p.m., and even though I knew nothing would come for me, I couldn't help but listen for my name. Hope is a stubborn thing, apparently immune to years of disappointment. Carlos got letters from his kids every week, crayon drawings, school photos, report cards. He'd show them around proudly, and guys would nod approvingly at his daughter's A in spelling or his son's soccer trophy. Tommy's mother sent care packages with homemade cookies and current photos of family gatherings. Even Big Jim got occasional letters from cousins and old friends. The absence of mail becomes its own presence after a while. It's not just that you don't get letters. It's that everyone knows you don't get letters. Your isolation becomes visible, a mark of shame that follows you through the halls. By year 10, I'd stopped writing the letters altogether. The bundle in my cell represented a decade of one-sided conversations with people who'd erased me from their lives. I kept the letters not because I hoped to send them someday, but because they were proof that I'd tried, proof that I'd refused to let their abandonment turn me bitter, at least not completely. But I was learning that hope and bitterness could coexist. I hoped for vindication while nurturing a cold anger at their betrayal. I hoped for freedom while accepting that forgiveness might be beyond me. The letters had taught me something important. My family's love had always been conditional. The condition was that I remained the version of myself they found acceptable. The moment I became inconvenient, embarrassing, or dangerous to their peace of mind, that love evaporated. Understanding that was both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking, because it meant I'd never really been unconditionally loved. Liberating, because it meant I could stop trying to earn back something I'd never actually had. The police report discrepancies I discovered became my roadmap to freedom, though I didn't recognize them as such at first. What started as desperate attempts to understand my conviction gradually revealed a pattern of investigative shortcuts and convenient assumptions that should have raised red flags. My legal education, cobbled together from prison library books and correspondence courses, finally reached the point where I could analyze my own case files with something approaching competence. The Innocence Project had sent me copies of everything: police reports, witness statements, evidence logs, crime scene photos, and I spread them across my cell floor like pieces of a puzzle. The first discrepancy I noticed was in the timeline. The neighbor who claimed to have seen someone matching my description leaving Harold's house at 10:30 p.m. had initially told police she wasn't sure of the time. Her first statement, buried in the supplemental reports, said she'd seen someone sometime after 10, but before the late news. The late news started at 11 p.m., but by the time she testified at trial, her memory had become remarkably precise. 10:30 p.m. exactly. She'd even added details about the person's height and clothing that weren't in her original statement. Someone had helped her refine her recollection. The second discrepancy was more troubling. The murder weapon, the knife from Harold's kitchen, had been processed for fingerprints, but the chain of custody documentation showed a gap. The knife had been logged into evidence at 11:45 p.m. the night of the murder, but there was no record of it being collected from the scene. The crime scene log showed officers arriving at 10:15 p.m. and securing the scene by 10:30 p.m. But somehow a crucial piece of evidence had materialized in the evidence locker over an hour later with no documentation of how it got there. I wrote to my court-appointed lawyer asking about these discrepancies. Jeffrey's response was a form letter thanking me for my interest, but explaining that the appeals process had been exhausted and there was nothing more he could do. He didn't address my specific questions. The third discrepancy was the most damning. Harold's coworker had testified that Harold mentioned having problems with me in the weeks before his death. But when I cross-referenced the dates of these alleged conversations with Harold's work schedule, I found that the coworker had been on vacation during 2 of the 3 incidents he described. He couldn't have spoken with Harold on those dates, because he wasn't even in the state. This wasn't sloppy police work, this was deliberate misdirection. I began mapping out everyone involved in the case. The responding officers, the detectives, the witnesses, the prosecutor. I looked for connections, relationships, anything that might explain why they'd all been so eager to pin Harold's murder on me without conducting a thorough investigation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Rodriguez, the librarian, had been following my research with quiet interest. One day, she brought me a newspaper article from a few months after my conviction. A caution, a conviction, a diction, a newspaper article from a few months after my conviction. Small item about one of the responding officers being disciplined for evidence tampering in an unrelated case. Officer Bradley Morrison had been caught planting drugs during a routine traffic stop. The incident had cost the department several convictions when defense attorneys argued that Morrison's credibility was compromised. But Morrison had been the first officer on the scene at Harold's house. He'd been alone with the crime scene for nearly 15 minutes before backup arrived. I requested Morrison's personnel file through a Freedom of Information request. It took 8 months to get a heavily redacted version, but what I could read was enlightening. Morrison had a history of what his supervisors euphemistically called aggressive investigative techniques. He'd been reprimanded twice for failing to follow proper evidence collection procedures. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was still incomplete. Someone had wanted Harold dead, and someone had wanted me to take the blame. The question was whether these were the same person or whether I'd simply been a convenient scapegoat. I started thinking about Harold's life in months before his death. According to the case files, he'd been having financial problems, but the details were vague. The investigation had focused so intently on building a case against me that they barely looked into other possible motives for his murder. I wrote letters to Harold's coworkers, his neighbors, anyone mentioned in the police reports. Most never responded, but a few did. Harold's next-door neighbor mentioned that Harold had seemed nervous in recent months, that he'd installed new locks and started packing his car in the garage instead of the driveway. A coworker said Harold had been getting phone calls at work. That upset him, calls he'd take outside so no one could overhear. These details hadn't appeared in any police report. The investigation had been laser-focused on proving I was guilty rather than discovering who actually was Dot by year 11. I had enough evidence to convince myself that I'd been framed, but not enough to convince a court. I needed help, real legal help from someone who specialized in wrongful convictions and had the resources to conduct a proper investigation. That's when I heard about the Innocence Project. The DNA testing request form I filled out for the Innocence Project was only 2 pages long. but it represented 12 years of accumulated hope and desperation compressed into black ink on white paper. Every answer felt crucial, every word chosen, with the careful precision of someone who understood this might be his only chance. I'd heard about the Innocence Project from Raymond during one of his volunteer visits. They're picky, he'd warned me. They get thousands of applications, but they can only take a fraction of the cases. You need to make yours stand out. The application asked for basic information first: the crime, the conviction date, the sentence. But then it got more complex. They wanted to know what new evidence might exist, what DNA testing had or hadn't been done, why I believed I was innocent. Most importantly, they wanted to know if there was biological evidence that could be tested. That last question was my stumbling block. DNA testing had been in its infancy when I was convicted 12 years earlier. My lawyer hadn't requested testing, probably because he'd assumed I was guilty and was just going through the motions of providing a defense. But the murder weapon, that knife from Harold's kitchen, had blood on it. Harold's blood, but possibly the killer's blood too. I spent weeks crafting my letter to accompany the application. I detailed every discrepancy I'd found in the case files, every piece of evidence that suggested a rushed investigation designed to pin the crime on me, rather than find the real killer. I explained about Officer Morrison's history of evidence tampering, about the witness whose story had changed, about the timeline inconsistencies, but I also tried to show them who I was beyond my conviction. I wrote about the education I'd pursued. In prison, the other inmates I'd helped learn to read, the victim impact programs I'd participated in despite maintaining my innocence. I wanted them to see that I wasn't just another convicted killer claiming innocence. I was someone who'd used 12 years in prison to become a better person, while never stopping his fight for justice. Mailing the application felt like throwing a message in a bottle into an ocean. I knew the odds were against me, but I also knew it was my best hope for getting real legal representation. The response came 4 months later. Not an acceptance, but not a rejection either. The Innocence Project wanted more information. Specifically, they wanted me to get a more detailed report on what biological evidence still existed from my case and whether it was in suitable condition for DNA testing. This meant working with the court system and the evidence storage facility. Bureaucratic mazes designed to discourage exactly what I was trying to do. It took another 6 months and dozens of letters, but I finally got confirmation that the murder weapon was still in evidence storage, and that there were blood samples that had never been subjected to modern DNA analysis. The second letter to the Innocence Project was easier to write because I had concrete information to offer. The blood on the knife wasn't just Harold's. There were at least 2 distinct samples, and only one had been identified as belonging to the victim. The other sample had been noted in the original lab report, but never tested for DNA markers because the technology hadn't been sophisticated enough at the time. This time, the response came faster. The Innocence Project was taking my case. My new attorney was a woman named Jennifer Walsh, no relation to any of the excluded names I'd been given, but sharp and dedicated in a way my original lawyer had never been. Our first phone conversation lasted 2 hours. She asked detailed questions about everything: the crime scene, the investigation, my family relationships, Harold's background, my own history. The DNA testing is just the first step, she explained. Even if we get results that exclude you, we'll need to build a comprehensive case, showing not just that you didn't do it, but pointing toward who did. The system doesn't like admitting it made mistakes, especially not mistakes this big. The DNA testing process was agonizingly slow. First, the evidence had to be located and verified. Then it had to be transferred to an approved laboratory. Then, the actual testing had to be conducted using protocols that would satisfy legal requirements. Each step took months. While we waited, Jennifer and her team began their own investigation into Harold's murder. They interviewed witnesses the original investigation had ignored, looked into Harold's financial problems more thoroughly, and examined the evidence tampering allegations against Officer Morrison. What they found confirmed my worst suspicions and gave me hope for the first time in over a decade. Harold had been involved with some dangerous people in the months before his death, people who had both motive and opportunity to kill him, people who would have benefited from having the murder blamed on someone else. But even with this new information, everything depended on the DNA results. Without scientific proof of my innocence, the rest would just be speculation and conspiracy theories. I tried not to get too excited as the testing neared completion. I'd been disappointed too many times to trust in easy victories. But late at night in my cell, I couldn't help but imagine what it would feel like to walk out of prison as a free man, vindicated after 12 years of fighting for the truth. I couldn't imagine what it would feel like to see my family again, because I wasn't sure I wanted to. The private investigator's report Jennifer commissioned revealed Harold's secret life like an archaeological dig, each layer of deception more disturbing than the last. The man my family had mourned as an innocent victim had been living a double life that put everyone around him in danger. Harold Whitman owed money to the wrong people, not credit card debt or mortgage problems, but gambling debts to a loan shark named Vincent Crawford, who had a reputation for collecting payments in blood when cash wasn't available. The report detailed Harold's weekend trips to illegal poker games, his losses at underground casinos, his increasingly desperate attempts to win back money he'd already lost in the 6 months before his death. Harold had borrowed nearly $50,000 from Crawford's operation. The interest rates were astronomical, compounding weekly, and Harold had fallen behind on payments almost immediately. According to the investigator's sources, Crawford had been pressuring Harold for the money and had made it clear that failure to pay would have consequences beyond Harold's own well-being. "Your stepfather was in deep," Jennifer explained during one of our phone calls. "The kind of deep where they start threatening family members to motivate payment. Your mother, your siblings, they would have all been potential targets if Harold couldn't pay up." This information cast my family's behavior during the trial in a new light. Their eagerness to see me convicted, their willingness to testify against me, their relief when the guilty verdict was announced. It all made sense. If they'd known about Harold's debts and the danger those debts posed to them, my conviction hadn't just solved the murder case. It had solved their survival problem. With Harold dead and his killer imprisoned, Crawford's operation would have no reason to pursue the debt further. The family was safe, and they'd gotten Harold's life insurance money to boot. The investigator had also uncovered something else. My mother had known about Harold's gambling problems. Bank records showed she'd withdrawn money from her own savings account 3 times in the months before Harold's death amounts that corresponded exactly to payments Harold had made to Crawford. She'd been helping him try to pay off his debts, but the most damning discovery was a police report that had been buried in the files. 2 weeks before Harold's murder, my mother had called 911 to report suspicious men watching their house. She'd told the dispatcher that Harold had been receiving threatening phone calls and that she was afraid for their safety. The responding officer had filed a brief report, but the information had never been shared with the detectives investigating Harold's murder. My family had known Harold was in danger. They'd known he was involved with dangerous people who might want to hurt him, but when he turned up dead, they'd been perfectly willing to let me take the blame rather than risk exposing themselves to Crawford's organization. The insurance payout made their motive even clearer. Harold had a $200,000 life insurance policy that paid double for accidental death or murder. My mother had collected $400,000 within 6 months of Harold's death, money that had paid off the family's mortgage and funded my siblings' college educations. If Harold's murder had been connected to his gambling debts, If Crawford's people had been involved, there might have been legal challenges to the insurance payout. Insurance companies don't like paying claims when the beneficiaries might have been complicit in the death. But with a family member convicted of the murder, there were no questions asked. The payout was clean, final, and immediately available. My brother's engineering degree, my sister's wedding, my mother's comfortable retirement, all of it had been funded by Harold's death and my wrongful conviction. They'd literally profited from my imprisonment. The investigator had also tracked down some of Harold's gambling associates, men who'd been at the poker games where Harold had lost so much money. Their stories painted a picture of a man who'd become increasingly desperate in his final weeks, talking about insurance solutions and taking care of his family, even if something happened to him. One gambler remembered Harold saying something chilling just days before his death. "If something happens to me, at least my family will be taken care of, and they'll never have to worry about my debts following them." Had Harold known he was going to die? Had he somehow arranged his own murder to protect his family and provide for them financially? The thought was horrifying, but not impossible. Men in Harold's situation sometimes saw suicide by proxy as their only way out of an impossible situation. But even if Harold had orchestrated his own death, that didn't explain how I'd been framed for it. Someone had planted evidence, coached witnesses, and rushed the investigation to ensure I'd be convicted. That level of manipulation required inside knowledge of the police, investigation, and the cooperation of people with access to evidence. The report also revealed that Officer Morrison, the cop with the evidence tampering history, had financial problems of his own during the time of Harold's murder. He'd been going through expensive divorce and had gambling debts that made him vulnerable to outside pressure. It wasn't hard to imagine Crawford's organization convincing Morrison to ensure the investigation pointed away from them. And toward a convenient scapegoat. Reading the investigator's report was like watching my entire life recontextualized. My family's abandonment hadn't been about their belief in my guilt. It had been about their knowledge of their own complicity. They'd saved themselves by sacrificing me, and they'd gotten rich doing it. The DNA results couldn't come fast enough. I needed scientific proof of my innocence, not just to get out of prison, but to expose the conspiracy that had put me there. My family had betrayed me in ways I'd never imagined possible, and I wanted the world to know it. The DNA laboratory report that arrived on a Tuesday morning in year 12 contained the scientific proof of my innocence I'd been desperately seeking. But reading it felt surreal after so many years of imprisonment. Jennifer called me within an hour of receiving the results herself, her voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard since we'd started working together. "Kai, we got them," she said without preamble. "The DNA from the knife, it's not yours. It's not even close to being yours." The blood samples from the murder weapon told a clear story. Harold's blood was there, of course, but the second sample, the one that had never been properly tested 12 years earlier, belonged to someone else entirely. Someone with a criminal record whose DNA was already in the national database. Leonard Patterson, age 45, had been convicted of assault with a deadly weapon 3 times between 1995 and 2008. He was exactly the kind of person Crawford's loan shark operation would have used for enforcement. More importantly, Patterson had no connection to me or my family, no reason to frame me specifically, which meant someone else had directed the investigation toward me. Patterson died in a car accident in 2018, Jennifer continued, but his DNA profile is definitive. He was definitely at the crime scene, definitely handled that knife, and almost certainly killed Harold. The question now is proving how you got framed for it. The laboratory report was damning in its precision. Not only did it exclude me as the source of the killer's DNA, but it also raised questions about how my fingerprints had ended up on the murder weapon in the first place. The blood evidence showed that Patterson had gripped the knife after Harold was stabbed, which should have obscured or eliminated any previous fingerprints on the handle. Yet my prints had been clear and perfect. Exactly the kind of evidence that would convince a jury. Too perfect, according to the forensics expert Jennifer had consulted. Genuine fingerprints from someone handling a bloody knife would have been smeared, partial, compromised by the violence of the act. Mine looked like they'd been placed there, under controlled conditions. The DNA results also revealed something else. Troubling. Trace amounts of my DNA were found on a knife handle, but only in areas where my fingerprints appeared. This suggested that someone had used an object that contained my DNA, maybe a glass or utensil I'd used during a family dinner to plant. Biological evidence, along with the fingerprints. Jennifer was already preparing the legal paperwork to request my immediate release and full exoneration. The DNA evidence was so conclusive that even the prosecutor, who'd originally tried my case, would have difficulty arguing against it. But I had mixed feelings about the vindication I'd dreamed of for 12 years. Relief was there, certainly. The crushing weight of false guilt that I'd carried for over a decade was finally lifting. I hadn't imagined the discrepancies in the case, hadn't been paranoid about being framed. The evidence had been manipulated. The investigation had been compromised. I'd been an innocent man all along. But underneath the relief was a cold fury that grew stronger with each detail Jennifer shared. My family hadn't just abandoned me. They'd actively participated in my framing. The timing was too convenient, their cooperation too complete, their behavior too calculated to be coincidental. We need to discuss what happens next, Jennifer. Sod. The state will want to settle this quietly. They'll offer you compensation for the wrongful conviction, probably a substantial amount. But if you want to pursue criminal charges against the people involved in framing you, that's a different path entirely. I thought about my mother collecting $400,000 in insurance money while I sat in a cell for a crime I didn't commit. I thought about my siblings using that money for college while refusing to visit me. I thought about Officer Morrison tampering with evidence to ensure I'd be convicted of murder. I want them all exposed, I told her. Every single person who participated in this conspiracy. I don't care about the money. I want the truth to come out. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. That's going to be a much harder fight, Kai. Proving the DNA evidence is one thing. Proving a conspiracy involving your family and corrupt police officers is something else entirely. Are you prepared for what that might mean for your relationships with your family? I laughed, a sound that had no humor in it. What relationships? They wrote me off 12 years ago. They chose money and safety over their own son and brother. As far as I'm concerned, they made their choice about our relationships a long time ago. The DNA results would get me out of prison, but they were just the beginning of the justice I wanted. I'd spent 12 years learning to survive, to fight, to never give up. Now I was going to use those skills to ensure that everyone who'd participated in destroying my life faced consequences for their actions. My family thought they'd solved their problems by sacrificing me. They were about to learn that they just delayed the reckoning. The DNA evidence would prove my innocence, but I was going to prove their guilt. The laboratory report felt like a loaded weapon in my hands. After 12 years of being powerless, I finally had something that could destroy the people who destroyed me. The question was how far I was willing to go to use it. The release preparation checklist my social worker handed me seemed absurdly mundane given the magnitude of what was happening: getting a state ID, opening a bank account, finding temporary housing. After 12 years of having every aspect of my life controlled by the prison system, the prospect of making my own decisions about everything from what to eat for breakfast to where to sleep felt overwhelming. Most exonerees struggle with the transition more than they expect, Martha explained during our final counseling session. She was a kind woman in her 50s who'd worked with dozens of men like me, wrongfully convicted prisoners suddenly thrust back into a world that had moved on without them. The vindication feels good, but the practical realities of starting over can be challenging. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. While Martha talked about job placement services and psychological support groups, I was thinking about the court hearing scheduled for the following morning. Judge Harrison, the same judge who'd sentenced me 12 years earlier, would officially declare my conviction overturned and order my immediate release. More importantly, it would be the first time I'd seen my family since the day I was sentenced. Jennifer had warned me they'd probably be there. Exoneration hearings get media attention, she'd explained. Your family will want to be seen supporting you, especially once the reporters start asking questions about why they never visited you in prison. The hypocrisy was staggering. 12 years of silence, 12 years of returned letters and refused calls. But now that I was being vindicated, they'd want to be photographed embracing me on the courthouse steps. They'd probably have prepared statements about how they'd always believed in my innocence and how grateful they were that the truth had finally come to light. The truth. That was the ironic part. They knew the truth better than anyone. I'd made a decision about how to handle their inevitable appearance at my exoneration hearing. I wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't confront them publicly, wouldn't give the media a dramatic family confrontation to sensationalize. But I also wouldn't pretend that everything was fine. The 12 years of abandonment could be erased with a few tears and some carefully worded apologies. I had plans for my family, but they would unfold privately, away from cameras in courtrooms. Practical aspects of my release were being handled by Jennifer and her team. The state would provide immediate compensation, a standard amount for wrongfully convicted individuals, plus additional funds based on the length of my imprisonment. It would be enough to get me started, to rent an apartment, buy a car, begin rebuilding a life. But I also had the insurance settlement to consider. $400,000 that rightfully should have gone to Harold's next of kin, not to the family that had helped frame me for his murder. Jennifer was confident we could recover at least a portion of that money through civil litigation, especially once we proved their complicity in my wrongful conviction. The psychological adjustment is often harder than the practical one, Martha continued. You've spent 12 years in a structured environment where your choices were limited. Suddenly having complete freedom can be paralyzing for some people. I understood what she meant, but I didn't think it would be a problem for me. I'd been planning my freedom for years, not just dreaming about it, but actively preparing for it. I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life once I got out, and most of it involved ensuring that the people who'd put me here faced consequences for their actions. The hardest part about preparing for release wasn't the practical considerations, it was managing my expectations about what freedom would feel like. I'd built up this moment for so long that I worried the reality might be anticlimactic. But as I sat in my cell for what I hoped would be the last time, packing the few possessions I'd accumulated over 12 years, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a decade. Genuine optimism about the future. The newspaper headline from that morning was everything I dreamed of seeing for 12 years. Local man freed after 12 years. DNA proves innocence. But as I sat in the courthouse holding cell waiting for my hearing, the vindication felt hollow. The headline told only half the story, the half that made me look like a victim of an unfortunate mistake rather than the target of a deliberate conspiracy. Judge Harrison looked older than I remembered, grayer around the temples and more lined around the eyes. He'd sentenced hundreds of people in the 12 years since my conviction, but I could see in his expression that he remembered me. Remembered the young man who'd stood before him, maintaining his innocence even as the evidence seemed overwhelming. Mr. Andrews, he began, using my last name with a formality that felt strange after years of being called by my first name or prisoner number. The court has reviewed the DNA evidence submitted by your counsel, and it is conclusive. The state of Pennsylvania hereby overturns your conviction for the murder of Harold Whitman and orders your immediate release from custody. The words I'd waited 12 years to hear should have felt triumphant. Instead, they felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. I turned to look at the gallery and saw them. My entire family seated in the front row like they'd been there supporting me all along. My mother wore a black dress similar to the one she'd worn when testifying against me, but her expression was completely different. Where there had been cold certainty then, now there were tears and what looked like genuine relief. My brother, now 32 and wearing an expensive suit that spoke to his success as an engineer, had his arm around our sister. She was crying too, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Even from across the courtroom, I could see how much they both changed. Success and prosperity had marked them in ways I hadn't expected. Behind them sat my grandmother's sister and several cousins I hadn't seen since childhood. The extended family had come out for my vindication. People who'd been notably absent during my trial and conviction. Jennifer squeezed my shoulder as the judge finished his remarks. "How does it feel?" she whispered. I looked back at my family, at their tears and their apparent joy at my freedom, and felt nothing but cold calculation. "Like the real work is just beginning," I replied. The media was waiting outside the courthouse, exactly as Jennifer had predicted. Cameras and microphones thrust toward me as I walked down the courthouse steps. Reporters shouting questions about how it felt to be free, what I planned to do next, whether I harbored any anger toward the system that had failed me. I was prepared for this part. "I'm grateful that the truth has finally come to light," I said, the words I'd practiced sounding natural despite their careful construction. "The DNA evidence speaks for itself. I've always maintained my innocence, and now science has proven it." "What about your family?" one reporter called out. "How does it feel to be reunited with them after all these years?" That's when my mother stepped forward, moving into the frame of every camera present. "We never stopped believing in Kai's innocence," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This has been a nightmare for our entire family. We're just grateful that our son is finally coming home." The lie was so bold, so complete, that I almost admired it. 12 years of refused visits, returned letters, and cold silence erased with a single sentence delivered to the cameras with perfect maternal conviction. My brother nodded along with her statement. "We always knew this day would come," he added. "Justice has finally been served." My sister was too emotional to speak coherently, but her tears looked genuine enough for the cameras. The picture they painted was of a family that had suffered alongside me, that had never wavered in their support despite the overwhelming evidence that had convinced the jury of my guilt. I stood there listening to them rewrite history in real time, their performance flawless for an audience that had no way of knowing the truth. The reporters ate it up, asking follow-up questions about how the family had coped during my imprisonment, what our reunion would be like, whether we planned to sue the state for the wrongful conviction. "Right now, we just want to focus on being together again," my mother said, reaching for my hand in a gesture that would look perfect in tomorrow's newspapers. "We have 12 years of lost time to make up for." I let her take my hand, felt the warmth of her fingers against mine for the first time in over a decade. But I also felt the coldness underneath, the calculation behind her tears. She was performing for the cameras, just as she'd performed in the courtroom all those years ago, when she squeezed my hand and smiled at me with what looked like genuine maternal love. I squeezed back and smiled in return. But my smile wasn't for her, it was for the cameras, for the performance we were both giving, for the beautiful irony of the moment. She thought she was managing the narrative, controlling how our reunion would be perceived by the public. She thought her lies would become the official version of our family story. What she didn't know was that I had my own plans for how this story would end. The family photo from my release day would later appear in newspapers across the state, showing what looked like a joyous reunion between a wrongfully convicted man and the family that had never stopped believing in him. My mother's arm around my shoulders, my siblings flanking us with tear-stained faces, all of us smiling for the cameras in what appeared to be a moment of pure happiness and vindication. The photo was a masterpiece of deception. We should go somewhere private to talk, my mother suggested once the media attention died down and the cameras were packed away. There's so much we need to discuss, so much time to catch up on. I agreed, curious to see how they planned to handle the private conversation. Would they maintain their public fiction when it was just us, or would they acknowledge the reality of what had happened over the past 12 years? We went to my mother's house, the same house where I'd grown up, where Harold had lived and died. It looked smaller than I remembered, but well-maintained in a way that spoke to financial security. New windows, fresh paint, a manicured lawn that someone was clearly paying to maintain. Insurance money and my imprisonment had been good to my family. Inside, the house had been redecorated entirely. Gone were the family photos that had once included me, replaced by pictures of my siblings' graduations, my sister's wedding, family gatherings I'd never attended. It was as if I'd been erased from the family history, my existence edited out of their story. "Sit down, honey," my mother said, gesturing toward the living room sofa. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Tea?" I remember you used to love my iced tea. The casual domesticity of the offer struck me as surreal. She was acting as if I'd just come home from college for the weekend, rather than returning after 12 years in prison for a murder I didn't commit. My siblings settled into chairs across from me, and for a moment we all just looked at each other. The years had changed us all, but the changes in them seemed comfortable, natural. Success and prosperity suited them. My changes were harder, carved by years of survival in an environment they couldn't imagine. "We're so sorry, Kai," my sister finally said, breaking the silence. "We're sorry for everything you went through. We're sorry we couldn't." She paused, searching for words. "We're sorry we couldn't be there for you the way we should have been." It was a carefully constructed apology, acknowledging regret without admitting specific wrongdoing. She was sorry I'd gone through something difficult, not sorry they'd caused it. "Why couldn't you be there?" I asked quietly. "Why couldn't any of you visit me, write to me, take my calls? I was your son, your brother. I was innocent. Didn't that matter to you?" My brother shifted uncomfortably. "The evidence was so overwhelming, Kai. Everyone, the police, the lawyers, the jury, everyone said you were guilty. We didn't know what to believe." "You could have believed me," I said. "I told you I was innocent. I told you from the very beginning that I didn't kill Harold. But you chose to believe everyone else instead." My mother's composure began to crack slightly. "You have to understand the position we were in. The whole community was watching us, judging us. People were saying we'd raised a killer, that we must have known something was wrong with you. We had to protect ourselves, protect your siblings' futures." There was the truth underneath all. The tears and apologies. They hadn't abandoned me because they believed I was guilty. They'd abandoned me because associating with me was inconvenient, embarrassing, potentially damaging to their social standing and future prospects. "So you threw me away to protect your reputations," I said. "It wasn't like that," my sister protested. "We were grieving Harold, dealing with the shock of everything that happened. We weren't thinking clearly. For 12 years?" I asked. "You weren't thinking clearly for 12 years?" The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things they weren't saying. They couldn't admit the real reason they'd abandoned me, that they'd known about Harold's gambling bets, known about the danger his death had eliminated, known that my conviction protected them from questions they didn't want to answer. "We want to make it up to you," my mother finally said. "We want to be a family again. We've missed you so much." I studied her face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or recognition of what they'd put me through. Instead, I saw calculation, the same careful management of perception that had characterized their courthouse performance. They wanted to be a family again, but only now that it was safe. Only now that I'd been vindicated and they could associate with me without embarrassment. only now that they could benefit from being seen as the loving family that had never stopped believing in my innocence. "What exactly did you miss about me?" I asked. "My letters that you returned unopened? My phone calls that you refused to accept? The visits you never made? What part of our relationship over the past 12 years are you nostalgic for?" My brother tried a different approach. "Look, we know we made mistakes. We know we handled things badly. But we're family, Kai. We can work through this. We can build something new." Build something new. As if 12 years of abandonment were just a bump in the road, an unfortunate misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with good intentions and family dinners. I stood up from the sofa, suddenly exhausted by their performance. "I need some time to process all of this," I told them. "It's been a long day, and I'm still adjusting to being free." "Of course," my mother said quickly. "Take all the time you need. We're not going anywhere. We'll be here when you're ready." But as I walked toward the door, I couldn't help but notice how relieved they all looked that I was leaving. Their obligation to pretend everything was fine, their performance of family reunion, could be set aside for now. They'd done their duty, made their gestures, offered their apologies. Now they could go back to their comfortable lives and wait for me to come around. They had no idea that I had spent 12 years not just proving my innocence, but planning my revenge. Harold's life insurance policy documents told the story my family had hoped would never come to light. The papers, which I obtained through Jennifer's investigation, revealed not just the $400,000 payout my mother had received, but the timing of policy changes that painted a damning picture of premeditation and conspiracy. 6 months before his death, Harold had increased his life insurance coverage from $100,000 to $200,000, with double indemnity for accidental death or murder. The timing coincided perfectly with when his gambling debts to Crawford's organization had begun spiraling out of control. But more interesting was what had happened to that money after Harold's death. My mother had received the full $400,000 payout within 3 months of my conviction. She'd used it to pay off the family's mortgage, fund my siblings' college educations, and purchase a new car. The family's lifestyle had improved dramatically during the years I'd spent in prison. The financial records Jennifer's team had assembled showed a family that had been struggling before Harold's death, but had achieved comfortable middle-class prosperity afterward. My brother's engineering degree from a prestigious university, my sister's elaborate wedding, my mother's early retirement, all of it funded by insurance. Money that had only been available because I'd been convicted of Harold's murder. If Harold's death had been connected to his gambling debts, if questions had been raised about the family's knowledge of his dangerous associations, the insurance company might have investigated more thoroughly before paying out. Insurance fraud investigations could have frozen the money for years, or resulted in the policy being voided entirely. But with a family member convicted of the murder, there were no questions asked. The case was closed. The family were innocent victims, and the money flowed freely. During one of our strategy sessions, Jennifer laid out the full scope of what we'd discovered. "Your family didn't just benefit from your wrongful conviction," she explained. "They actively participated in creating the conditions that made your conviction possible." The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. My mother's 911 call about suspicious men watching the house had been buried, never shared with the homicide detectives. Her testimony at trial had painted me as unstable and money-hungry, characteristics that fit the prosecution's narrative perfectly. My siblings had corroborated her story about my supposed request for money and volatile behavior. Most damning was what we'd learned about the timeline of Harold's death. My mother had been the one to discover the body and call 911, but the coroner's report suggested Harold had been dead for at least 2 hours before she'd made that call. She'd claimed to have been shopping during the window when the murder occurred, but there were no receipts, no credit card records, No witnesses to support her alibi. "We think your mother knew Harold was going to be killed," Jennifer said bluntly. "We think she may have even arranged it, working with Crawford's people to eliminate Harold's debts while ensuring the insurance payout would be clean." The theory was horrifying but logical. Harold's gambling debts had put the entire family at risk. His death would eliminate that threat while providing them with financial security, but only if the murder could be blamed on someone unconnected to Crawford's organization. I was the perfect scapegoat. Young male, with access to the house and a history of minor conflicts with Harold. My fingerprints were already on file from a minor arrest in college. Most importantly, I lived alone with no solid alibi for the night of the murder. Officer Morrison's evidence tampering had ensured my fingerprints appeared on the murder weapon in exactly the right way to suggest I'd been the killer. The witness who'd claimed to see someone matching my description had been coached to refine her testimony. The investigation had been steered away from Harold's gambling connections and toward building a case against me. My family's cooperation had been essential to making it all work. Their testimony had provided the motive and character evidence needed to convince a jury. Their abandonment of me after my arrest had reinforced the narrative that even my own family believed I was guilty. "The question is what we do with this information," Jennifer continued. "We can't prove all of it in court. Too much is circumstantial, and some of the key witnesses are dead. But we can use it as leverage." Leverage. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. My family had destroyed my life for money and safety, and now I was supposed to use their crimes as a bargaining chip rather than seeking justice. What kind of leverage? I asked. "Civil litigation for the insurance money, first of all. We can make a strong case that the payout was obtained through fraudulent means. Even if we can't prove criminal conspiracy, we can probably recover most of that $400,000 plus interest. $400,000 plus 12 years of interest would be substantial, enough to fund a very comfortable life for myself. But it wouldn't be justice. It would just be another financial transaction, another way for my family to pay their way out of consequences." "What about criminal charges?" I pressed. Jennifer shook her head. "The statute of limitations has passed on most of the crimes we can prove. Officer Morrison is dead. Harold is dead. Crawford's organization was dismantled years ago. The only people left are your family members, and the evidence against them is largely circumstantial. So they were going to get away with it. 12 years of my life stolen, and the people responsible would face no meaningful consequences. They'd gotten rich off my suffering, and the legal system that had failed me so completely the first time was failing me again. But I was learning that justice and revenge were different things, and that sometimes you had to create your own consequences when the system wouldn't provide them. The insurance money was just the beginning. I had something much more valuable than financial leverage over my family. I had the truth. And the truth, properly deployed, could destroy everything they'd built on the foundation of my wrongful conviction." The legal settlement agreement from the state arrived 2 weeks after my exoneration, a document that reduced 12 years of wrongful imprisonment to a series of dollar amounts and legal disclaimers. $2.4 million in compensation, minus attorney fees and administrative costs. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, but it felt like blood money payment for a life stolen, years that could never be returned. What made the settlement even more significant was the timing. My family's sudden renewed interest in my welfare had begun the moment news of my potential compensation became public. Phone calls that had gone unanswered for 12 years were suddenly returned within hours. Invitations to family dinners materialized after over a decade of silence. My mother called me 3 times in the week after the settlement was announced. Each conversation a masterclass in manipulation disguised as maternal concern. "We should celebrate your vindication," she'd suggested during the second call. "Maybe take a family vacation together. somewhere we can really reconnect. I know money can't make up for what you've been through, but at least now you'll be financially secure. The assumption that I'd want to share my compensation with them, that my newfound wealth was somehow a family windfall rather than payment for their betrayal, revealed everything I needed to know about their motivations. I decided it was time to establish some ground rules. I arranged individual meetings with each family member, starting with my mother. We met at a restaurant downtown, neutral territory where their dramatic tendencies would be constrained by public setting. I've been doing a lot of thinking about our relationship. I began once we'd ordered coffee, about what happened 12 years ago and about what happens next. She leaned forward eagerly, probably expecting some kind of reconciliation speech. I'm so glad you're ready to move forward, Kai. We all want to put this behind us and focus on the future. That's interesting phrasing, I said. Put this behind us, as if my 12 years in prison were something that happened to all of us equally, something we all need to recover from together. Her smile faltered slightly. Well, no, of course not. You suffered the most. But it was hard on all of us too, having you gone, not knowing if you'd ever come home. You didn't know I'd come home because you never tried to bring me home, I replied calmly. You testified against me at trial. You returned my letters. You refused my calls. You told the media yesterday that you never stopped believing in my innocence, but your actions for 12 years said the opposite. Kai, honey, you have to understand. No, I interrupted. I don't have to understand anything. What I have to do is decide whether I want you in my life going forward and under what conditions. The directness seemed to shock her. She'd expected me to be grateful for her renewed attention, eager to rebuild our relationship on her terms. She hadn't expected me to set terms of my own. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, I continued, it starts with honesty, complete honesty about what happened 12 years ago, about Harold's gambling debts, about the insurance money, about why you were so eager to see me convicted. Her face went pale. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. I think you know exactly what I mean. The question is whether you're willing to tell the truth, or whether you want to keep pretending that you're the grieving mother who stood by her innocent son. The silence stretched between us. I could see her calculating, trying to decide how much she could admit without incriminating herself completely. The insurance money goes back, I said finally. All of it, plus interest. That's non-negotiable. Kai, that money paid for your siblings' educations, for the house. That money was blood money. It was paid out because I was wrongfully convicted of a murder I didn't commit. If you want any relationship with me, it gets returned. I had similar conversations with my brother and sister over the next few days. Their responses were variations on the same theme: initial shock at my directness, followed by attempts to negotiate, followed by barely concealed anger when they realized I wasn't going to simply forgive and forget. My brother tried the rational approach. Look, I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But destroying the family isn't going to change what happened. We can't undo the past 12 years. You're right, I agreed. We can't undo them, but we can acknowledge them honestly, and we can make sure there are consequences for the choices that were made. My sister went with emotional manipulation. We're family, Kai. We're all we have left. Grandma's gone. Dad's been gone for years. Do you really want to tear apart what's left of our family over money? This isn't about money, I told her. This is about accountability. This is about recognizing that actions have consequences, even when those actions were taken against a family member. None of them were willing to meet my conditions. None of them were willing to admit their complicity in my wrongful conviction, or return the insurance money they'd spent while I sat in prison. They wanted reconciliation without responsibility, forgiveness without accountability. So I made my position clear to all of them, until they were ready to tell the truth about what had really happened 12 years ago. And until they were prepared to make meaningful amends for their betrayal, we had nothing to discuss. "You're being unreasonable," my mother said during our final conversation. "We made mistakes, but we're family. Family forgives each other. Family also protects each other," I replied. "Family doesn't abandon each other when things get difficult. Family doesn't profit from each other's suffering." You taught me what family means by showing me what it doesn't mean. The ultimatum was simple: genuine accountability and the return of the insurance money, or permanent separation. They had 30 days to decide. I wasn't surprised when 30 days passed without any of them reaching out. They'd made their choice 12 years ago, and they were making it again now. Money and comfort and reputation mattered more to them than relationships or integrity or justice. But that was fine. I'd spent 12 years learning to live without them. I could spend the rest of my life the same way. The audio recording I'd been searching for finally surfaced 6 months after my release, hidden in a box of Harold's personal effects that had been stored in my mother's basement since his death. The cassette tape was labeled "For Insurance" in Harold's handwriting, and what it contained was his final insurance policy, not financial, but evidential. Harold had recorded the conversation on the night he died, apparently knowing that his meeting with Crawford's enforcer might be his last. The recording was poor quality, filled with static and muffled voices, but the content was clear enough to change everything. "I can't pay what I owe," Harold's voice said, shaky but determined. "But I can give you something better than money. I can give you a clean ending to this whole problem." The other voice was gravelly, impatient. "We don't want your promises, Harold. We want our money. Listen to me," Harold continued. "My stepson, he's got a record. He's got access to the house. He's got motive if you set it up right. Frame him for killing me, and everybody wins. You get your debt settled, my family gets the insurance money, and nobody comes looking for you." The silence that followed was broken by the other man's laughter. "You want us to kill you and frame your kid for it? That's your big solution?" "He's not my kid," Harold said coldly. "He's my wife's kid from her first marriage. I don't owe him anything. And this way, my real family stays safe. The insurance payout is $400,000 enough to pay what I owe with plenty left over for my wife and her kids." The recording continued for another few minutes, with Harold providing details about my schedule, my apartment, my habits. He gave them my fingerprints lifted from a glass I'd used during a family dinner and suggested the best way to plant evidence that would implicate me. Most chilling was his final statement: "My wife knows about the plan. She'll play her part when the time comes. She's got more reason than anyone to want this problem solved." The tape ended there, but it was enough. Harold hadn't just been killed by Crawford's people. He'd orchestrated his own murder and my framing. As part of an elaborate scheme to pay his gambling debts while providing for his family financially, my mother hadn't just cooperated with my framing. She'd been a full partner in planning it. I called Jennifer immediately. "We need to meet," I said. "I found something that changes everything." She listened to the recording twice, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "This is it," she said finally. "This is the smoking gun we needed." Harold's voice, his own words, admitting to conspiracy to commit murder and frame you for it. Can we use it in court? Absolutely. It's Harold's own voice, recorded by Harold himself. It's admissible evidence of a conspiracy that cost you 12 years of your life. More importantly, it proves your mother's perjury at trial and her complicity in the framing. The recording revealed the full scope of the betrayal. My mother had known from the beginning that I was innocent. She testified against me anyway, helping to ensure my conviction so she could collect the insurance money and eliminate the threat. Harold's gambling debts posed to the family. My siblings might not have known about the conspiracy initially, but they'd certainly benefited from it. Harold's insurance money had paid for their educations, their comfortable lives, their prosperity during the years I'd rotted in prison for a crime they knew I hadn't committed. "What are our options?" I asked Jennifer. "Criminal charges against your mother for perjury, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. Civil suits against all of them for the insurance fraud. Public exposure of the entire conspiracy. We can destroy them legally, financially, and socially." For the first time since my release, I felt something approaching satisfaction. Not happiness, the 12 lost years could never be returned, but a sense that justice might finally be possible. "There's something else we need to consider," Jennifer continued. "The recording also proves that you were specifically targeted because Harold thought you'd be a convincing scapegoat. Your youth, your minor criminal record, your access to the house, it was all calculated. This wasn't random bad luck. You were deliberately chosen to be destroyed. The revelation that my stepfather had seen me as disposable enough to sacrifice for his gambling debts was almost worse than learning about my mother's complicity. I'd never been close to Harold, but I'd never imagined he actively despised me enough to orchestrate my life's destruction. But now I had proof. Undeniable, recorded proof of exactly what had been done to me and who had done it. The question was how far I was willing to go to make them pay for it. I thought about my mother's tears at the courthouse, her performance for the cameras about never losing faith in my innocence. I thought about my siblings' comfortable lives, built on the foundation of my suffering. I thought about 12 years in a cell, 12 years of believing that my own family thought I was a killer. "I want to destroy them," I told Jennifer. "All of them. I want the world to know exactly what they did to me." She nodded grimly. "Then that's exactly what we're going to do." The Memorial Scholarship Fund certificate I established in Harold's victims' names represented a choice I'd never expected to make using my settlement. Money to honor other people who'd been wrongfully convicted rather than pursuing maximum vengeance against my family. The Harold Whitman Memorial Scholarship for Criminal Justice Reform would provide legal aid to indigent defendants and fund DNA testing for prisoners, maintaining their innocence. The irony wasn't lost on me. Harold's name would be attached to efforts to prevent exactly the kind of injustice he'd orchestrated against me. It felt like poetic justice, or perhaps just poetry. The decision came after months of legal proceedings that had exposed every detail of the conspiracy to the public. The audio recording had been devastating evidence, leading to criminal charges against my mother for perjury and conspiracy after the fact. My siblings faced civil litigation for the insurance fraud, and the media had covered every revelation with the kind of breathless attention usually reserved for celebrity scandals. The family that had abandoned me to protect their reputation had seen that reputation destroyed completely. My mother's arrest had been front-page news. My siblings' comfortable lives had been shattered by legal fees and social ostracism. The insurance money had been clawed back with interest, leaving them financially ruined. I should have felt satisfied. For months, I felt satisfied, watching them experience consequences for their actions, seeing them face the kind of public judgment and systemic failure they'd subjected me to. It had been gratifying in ways I'd never expected, but satisfaction and peace were different things. I was learning. The turning point came during my mother's sentencing hearing. She stood before the same judge who'd sentenced me 12 years earlier, looking older and frailer than I remembered. The liar had negotiated a plea deal, 2 years in prison for perjury and conspiracy, with eligibility for early release. "Your Honor," she said when given the opportunity to speak, "I know nothing I say can excuse what I did. I know I can't undo the harm I caused my son. I was scared, desperate, and I made the worst choice a mother could make. I sacrificed my child to save myself and my other children." She turned to look at me then, sitting in the gallery. "Kai, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that not a day has passed in 12 years that I haven't regretted what I did. The money, the safety, the comfortable life, none of it was worth what it cost you." Her tears looked genuine this time, unlike the performance she'd given at my exoneration. But even genuine remorse couldn't return 12 years of my life or erase the betrayal that had defined our relationship. After the hearing, my siblings approached me in the courthouse hallway. They looked broken in ways that went beyond financial ruin. The revelation of our mother's complicity had shattered their understanding of their own lives, their own prosperity, their own moral standing. "We didn't know," my sister said quietly, "about Harold's plan, about Mom's involvement. We really thought you might have done it. But you were willing to benefit from thinking that," I replied. "You were willing to use the insurance, money, go to college, build comfortable lives, all while believing your brother was a killer sitting in prison." My brother nodded miserably. "You're right. Even if we didn't know about the conspiracy, we should have supported you. We should have visited, should have fought for you, should have questioned the evidence. We failed you as a family." Their acknowledgement of responsibility felt different than our mother's courtroom apology. Less calculated, more genuine. But it also came too late to change anything fundamental about our relationships. Standing in that courthouse hallway, looking at the wreckage of the family that had once abandoned me, I realized that revenge had been easier than I'd expected, but less satisfying than I'd hoped. They were suffering now, facing consequences for their actions. But their suffering didn't heal my wounds or restore my lost years. That's when I decided to establish the scholarship fund. If I couldn't get my years back, if I couldn't undo the damage their betrayal had caused, at least I could try to prevent other people from experiencing the same injustice. The fund would provide legal representation for defendants who couldn't afford competent counsel. It would pay for DNA testing for prisoners maintaining their innocence. It would fund training programs for public defenders and awareness, campaigns about wrongful convictions. Harold's name on the scholarship was my final act of justice ensuring that his legacy would be tied to efforts to prevent the kind of corruption and conspiracy he'd embodied. I met with each family member one final time before the scholarship was announced. I wanted them to understand what I was doing and why. "I'm not doing this to hurt you further," I told my mother during our last conversation before she began her prison sentence. "I'm doing it because carrying hatred for 12 years in prison taught me that revenge is just another kind of prison. I refuse to spend the rest of my life locked up by anger." She nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "Well, you could. You ever forgive us?" I considered the question carefully. "Forgiveness and reconciliation are different things," I said finally. "I can forgive you for being human, for being scared, for making terrible choices under impossible pressure. But I can't reconcile with you. I can't pretend we're family again. Trust, once broken this completely, doesn't get repaired." It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and probably the last meaningful one we'd ever have. The scholarship fund announcement made national news, framed as a story of a wrongfully convicted man choosing healing over hatred. The media attention brought in additional donations from people who'd followed my case, and within 6 months, we'd funded legal representation for dozens of indigent defendants and DNA testing for over 100 prisoners claiming innocence. 3 of those tests had already resulted in exonerations. Justice, I was learning, wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about preventing future injustices, about using your own suffering to reduce the suffering of others. The Memorial Scholarship wouldn't bring back my 12 lost years, but it might prevent someone else from losing theirs. The speaking engagement program I developed became my unexpected calling, transforming 12 years of suffering into a platform for change that reached thousands of people across the country. The certificate from the National Criminal Justice Reform Coalition recognizing my advocacy work sits framed in my apartment, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that survival can become purpose. 2 years after my exoneration, I was invited to speak at law schools, police academies, and judicial conferences about wrongful convictions and the systemic failures that enable them. Standing before audiences of future lawyers, current cops, and sitting judges, I could see in their faces the impact of hearing directly from someone who lived through the system's worst failures. 12 years ago, I was a 22-year-old kid who trusted that truth would prevail. I would begin each presentation. I believed that innocence was its own protection, that family loyalty was unconditional, that the justice system worked. I was wrong about all of those things, and learning those lessons cost me 12 years of my life. The presentations weren't just about my case. They were about the broader patterns that enable wrongful convictions. Rushing to judgment, confirmation, bias, evidence tampering, inadequate defense representation, and the pressure on families to distance themselves from accused relatives. Each element of my story illuminated systemic problems that went far beyond any individual case. But the most powerful part of each presentation was when I talked about the aftermath, about the choice between bitterness and purpose, between revenge and reform, between remaining a victim and becoming an advocate. The people who destroyed my life thought they were solving their problems, I would explain. They eliminated a threat, secured financial benefits, and moved on with their comfortable existence. What they didn't anticipate was that their actions would eventually create someone dedicated to preventing similar injustices from happening to others. The speaking engagements led to consulting work with innocence projects across the country. I helped other exonerees navigate the complex transition from prison to freedom, drawing on hard-won experience about the psychological and practical challenges of rebuilding a life after wrongful conviction. Some of the exonerees I worked with had maintained relationships with their families throughout their imprisonment. Others, like me, had been abandoned by people who should have supported them. But all of us struggled with similar questions. How do you trust again after being betrayed by the system and the people who were supposed to protect you? How do you build meaningful relationships when your faith in human loyalty has been shattered? How do you find purpose after having so many years stolen from you? I found that helping others answer those questions helped me continue answering them for myself. That my relationship with my family remained permanently severed, but I'd made peace with that reality. My mother served 18 months of her 2-year sentence and was released to a life of social ostracism and financial ruin. My siblings had attempted to rebuild their careers and reputations after the scandal, with limited success. We lived in the same city, but moved in completely different worlds. Occasionally, I would see one of them at a grocery store or coffee shop. We would make eye contact, nod politely, and continue with our separate lives. There was no animosity anymore, but there was also no connection. They were strangers who happened to share my DNA and my history. The Memorial Scholarship Fund had grown beyond my initial expectations, funded not just by my settlement money, but by donations from people who'd followed my story. We'd helped exonerate 17 wrongfully convicted individuals in 2 years. And the number was growing as DNA technology improved and legal advocacy became more sophisticated. Each exoneration felt like a small victory against the system that had failed me, proof that Harold's name was now associated with justice rather than corruption. It was a form of redemption I'd never expected to achieve. On quiet evenings in my apartment, I sometimes thought about the path that had led me here. 22 years old when arrested, 34 when released, 36 now as I wrote these words. 14 years of my adult life shaped by a crime I didn't commit and a family that chose money over loyalty. But I'd also learned that trauma, properly processed, could become wisdom. That suffering, channeled constructively, could become service. That betrayal, understood completely, could teach you the true value of integrity. The young man who'd been arrested that Tuesday night in March had believed that family was unconditional. That truth always emerged, that the system protected the innocent. The man I'd become knew better, but had found ways to build a meaningful life despite or perhaps because of those harsh lessons. I wasn't the person I would have been if Harold hadn't orchestrated my framing, if my family hadn't abandoned me, if I hadn't spent 12 years in prison learning to survive and fight and never give up. That person might have been happier, more trusting, more conventional, but he wouldn't have understood the value of justice the way I did, wouldn't have devoted his life to preventing others from experiencing the betrayal and abandonment I'd endured. Standing at my apartment window, looking out at a city where I'd once been seen as a convicted killer and was now recognized as an advocate for justice, I felt something I'd never expected to feel again. Gratitude. Not gratitude for what had been done to me. 12 years stolen was still 12 years stolen. But gratitude for what I'd been able to do with the aftermath, for the purpose I'd found in the wreckage, for the lives I'd been able to touch through sharing my story. My family had thought they were destroying me to save themselves. Instead, they'd created someone dedicated to ensuring that families could never again sacrifice their own members for money and safety. In the end, that felt like the best possible revenge, turning their worst betrayal into my greatest purpose. If you've ever been abandoned by those who were supposed to love you unconditionally, know that survival is possible. That purpose can emerge from betrayal, and that sometimes the family you create through shared values and mutual respect is stronger than the one you're born into. Like and subscribe if this story of resilience, truth, and the complex journey of forgiveness resonated with you. Your support helps these stories reach others who need to hear them.